that means the system of law works effectively and fairly easily. And there has to be, of course, a system of health. That's all, a decent medical system. That's all part of the infrastructure. Now, I think Spain is very fortunate in its infrastructure. And it's not the result of the Zapatero government just, it's the result of 25 years of very fine democratic government. For all the turmoil that you may feel, the country has been, I think, governed extremely well since the beginnings of democracy in the late 1970s. That's the infrastructure. What you need for domination, of course, as well, is you need protection of those who are relatively weak. The government needs to draw on the values, the ideas that are out there in the culture of equality and of freedom, and using these to argue for protections that will genuinely entrench the liberty of the weakest. It's the weakest you look to when you want to know how free a society is. And here, for example, I do applaud what the Zapatero government has done, for example, in relation to women, with the law of equality, with the law of domestic abuse, in relation to workers, with, for example, the attempt at least to pull back the temporalitat, the temporary contracts, in relation to homosexuals, in relation to immigrants, in relation, well, it ought to, I would have said, it hasn't done enough with prisoners. Prisoners, you always look to those in prison in your society. You ask, how are they being treated? Because that is the flagship, the sign of how well the society is doing as a whole. I'd like to see more focus, more light thrown on Spain's prisons, where we know there's a lot of overcrowding. I worry about what's going on there. But in general, the government, I think, has taken steps that you have to applaud in regard to the protection of the weak. And then the other side of things is the state has got to itself make itself more transparent and more subject to the control of the citizenry. Now, it's true that the government, Zapatero's government, has been very controversial in many of the steps that it's taken. For example, with homosexual marriage, with the law of equality, with the regularization of the position of immigrants. I would say, though, and this is a challenge, you may say no, that in taking those steps it has been answerable to the values endorsed in this community as a whole. No one can say that equality is not a value that is endorsed and valorized and cherished in Spain, or freedom, and surely those are the values that have been invoked in support of these measures. But even if you think it's been controversial and maybe mistaken in some of those measures, as I know many of you will think, you've got to say that at least the government has begun to take some steps towards making itself more transparent and more contestable. So, for example, I really applaud the attempt to make the national broadcaster, television broadcaster, independent of government, because it's going to be an important spotlight on government that examines government. Actually, I said to Mr. Zapatero, when he invited me to give a lecture on republicanism in 2004, just after he had come to power, I said, you're going to find it very hard to implement these policies. Philosophy is easy, politics is difficult. And I gave that example. And he was actually quite fired up and responded, it was in response to that he invited me to do the review of his government 6 months before the next election to see how far, in my view, the government had been faithful to Republican principles. Well, in that principle it was very faithful. Get an external critic, establish the independent television station. Equally, it took some steps, at any rate, to, for example, to regularize publicity, to bring more issues to Parliament. So, for example, Spain can't any longer commit troops overseas without a full parliamentary debate. There is a problem in Spain, I think, with the politicized Tribunal Constitucional and the Consejo General del Poder Judicial. The government has not been able to do anything about that. I hope that something may happen in the next Parliament. But that is a weakness, because you need an independent court and an independent council for the judiciary to ensure that government is subject to that external pressure. However, at least the Zapatero government took some steps in that direction, in the front of controlling the state as well as protecting the weak. So I just mention these things to indicate where I think this long tradition, going back, as I say, to Aristotle, Polybius, and the long European tradition, to give you some idea of what that tradition has to say about contemporary Spanish politics, if we try to rescue it from the English mistake and the French mistake, and to reinstate it as a contemporary philosophy of government with these twin emphases on freedom as non-domination and a democratic, transparent, civically controlled government on the other hand. But I've gone on too long. I better stop at that, and thank you very much.